our office ever did. And it was in 1976 for a corporate facility in a rural setting in New Jersey. And I was pretty wet behind the ears in some ways. And in addition to proposing to keep and strengthen the existing hedgerow you see in the middle, I decided to dig a pond and make a hill with a hat of trees and to use orchard trees for the parking lot. I naively proposed to make a meadow with wildflowers, which is that pale yellow ochre color you see in the drawing. I got the pond dug, the hill was built, and we seeded it. Um, can we make some of these little pictures go way on the side here so we can see both pictures? Or is everybody seeing what I'm seeing, which is a string of pictures on the right?
I could see, we have two pictures right now on the screen.
Okay, well, I've got
whatever's on
five
your
on
screen
mine.
is what we could see.
Oh dear. Okay, well, we'll go forward. Anyway, we got it done, and I proposed this meadow, which you see with grasses and wildflower seeds, with a mown verge. And here you see it on the left. It took almost 3 years of battling some invasives to produce the meadow that you see. But a few years later, however, the president of the company had it all plowed under and turned into an entire site into a green desert of turf, typical Northern European fescues that cover thousands of square miles in North America today. The reason, he thought it looked messy. He hated it in the winter, and he worried that his country club friends would think his company couldn't afford maintenance. Well, my partners and I have continued to be interested in what I have to consider as one of the most fundamental landscape tropes, and that is the meadow. And over the years, we've introduced them in several projects where they seemed appropriate, such as this site in the middle of Ohio, which was prairie before it was farms and then towns, cities, and suburbs. This is an estate that one of my partners and I have worked on for nearly 30 years. We had a bit of a struggle, first getting them to appreciate the beauty and utility of a genuine meadow. Only in the past several years have we arrived at the decision to have a fine lawn adjacent to their house and with a genuine meadow beyond. Well, in the process, we've learned a lot, in part because when we started, no one was doing this, and the ecologists we talked to had never started from scratch with bare ground. They'd all begun with studies of transforming pastures or relic scraps of prairie or meadow. We were literally learning on the job. We were trying out stuff, and we were finding that it usually took about 3 years before we could get a fully working community of plants in a meadow. Now, many of our projects have been true collaborations with architects, where we've been able to produce something that neither of us could have quite thought of or invented and produced alone. Truly shared projects dependent upon imagination and expertise. Often they were in a fresh place or structure or landscape. For example, this is a conference center for the Church of the Latter-day Saints in Salt Lake City that I did with Bob Frasca of ZGF. Now, conference centers are like performance halls. They're invariably large windowless boxes. But inside, there were over 20,000 seats with beautiful views. But, and you know, there's more people sit inside this building than go to the arena for the Utah Jazz just down the street. But up on the roof, we were able to produce a 4-acre alpine meadow with contract grown native plants that we found were growing in the Wasatch Mountains nearby. And this now provides a habitat for a variety of migratory birds, beneficial insects, and small mammals right in the center of Salt Lake City. 15 years later, after that project, this is one of our most recent efforts in the Bay Area in California. It's on a 100-acre urban site where we've created over 20 acres of grasses and wildflowers. Some of them are native and others are from the Intermountain West and a few appropriate Mediterranean species. This is an experiment where we're anticipating climate change and the almost certain loss of a number of what have until very recently have been deemed natives. I'll come back to this particular topic later, but I'll only say that this image is of the second year of this particular meadow, and it's got pretty good coverage, but it's still a very immature meadow. Well, as you heard in the introduction, our office is generally known for urban work, for parks such as this early project of ours, which was the rescue and transformation of Bryant Park in Midtown Manhattan. Or this more recent project, a small urban piazza in downtown Portland, Oregon, called Director Park. It's quite popular, it's quite civic, but it's not very sylvan, and it's built atop of 6 stories of parking in the heart of the city. So our practice, which you heard, began in 1976, which is now, what, 45 years ago. And a few years after I began teaching at the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia. Because of working when I was young in the field as a civil engineer in Alaska and my subsequent degree in apprenticeship in architecture, our office has always been concerned with construction and technology and the use of appropriate means, methods, and materials for very different tasks. Our practice, like most of those that I know or care for, is grounded in collaboration and in employing all the tools available and appropriate for design and its realization. But we've also learned that time is a serious aspect of the medium, time in the design and in the creation and in the unfolding life of the places that we make. Architecture and landscape architecture are commonly businesses. In many offices, such as this one you see in the photo on the left I found in Chicago, they're really factories employing designers who make products. Our office, however, as you see in this picture on the right, began as a studio, and despite its current size and its ambitious projects, is still truly a studio with, in addition to its artistic and collaborative attributes, it also embraces research in the belief that these are not antithetical. Now, in the course of doing this, we engage a variety of research areas and methods, some below the radar and some hardly noticed. Some are conventional and some are well understood, and some are not known or perceived or at all or valued by others, particularly many of our colleagues in academia. Much of our research and its application is deeply embedded in our particular form of landscape architectural practice. Let me consider the topic of research for a moment for what it is, without the mystification and hyperbole that often cloaks it in academia. I generally think of research as consisting of three types: scientific research, humanities research, and artistic research. Each has its habits, achievements, and its limitations. In academia and the great research universities of America, it's been my experience to note that many of those engaged in each of these important aspects of human creativity, unfortunately, often have some skepticism and disdain for each other, which, needless to say, leads to great misunderstanding. Scientific research regards theories and explanations of nature, its properties, and its processes, it making possible various practical application. In the last century, it has become highly dependent upon mathematics and quantitative methods of measurement for documentation and verification. Some of this work, most familiar to our fields, concerns energy, climate, materials, structure, and topological systems, and various forms of applied chemistry, biology, ecology, physics, hydrology, and the earth sciences. Humanities research in recent decades has not necessarily searched for or believed in finding single or supposedly correct answers, but has instead explored issues and details concerning interesting or deeply important questions regarding social, political, cultural, ethnic, economic, and ethical topics. Historical research regarding art and architecture that employs primarily sources and evidence is one example. So too would be recent work regarding social interaction in public settings and the therapeutic nature of particular environments, such as the well-being for recovering medical patients or people suffering from Alzheimer's. Artistic research, also sometimes referred to as practice-based research, is probably the very least understood. It encompasses creative work, both the processes and the result, and offers alternative results from scientific and humanities research regarding possible reality, knowledge, or what might be. It's speculative, it's not definitive, and is capable of producing new and previously unanticipated or predictable associations and results, whether in music or theater, poetry, the visual arts, dance, or architecture and landscape architecture. Because success is almost always qualitative, this is a form of endeavor that, since it is neither quantifiable nor verifiable, most academics in science and the humanities have very great difficulty assessing it. Although, in my experience, when confronted with examples of excellence, they tend to recognize and appreciate it. Now, I had the good fortune to be introduced to research as a young person in Fairbanks, Alaska, where people I grew up with were studying geology, the stratosphere, permafrost, wildlife, the old Bering Sea culture, And contemporary indigenous people were all around the town, at the local university. They were in and out of our house. They were in high school. During high school, I even collected Pleistocene fossils with a renowned paleontologist. Growing up there, I was constantly looking at the environment because it was always in it. Here I am at age 14 with my sister on the banks of the Yukon River in Whitehorse, drawing it. Later, as a young architect and an artist in Seattle, I embarked upon an independent study of the Skid Road community and publicly became embroiled in a successful fight to save Pioneer Square and the Pike Place Market from a disastrous plan for urban renewal that would have demolished large and historic portions of the city. Dropping out of architecture in 1967, I spent a considerable time living in cabins on islands in the East Coast and the West Coast, writing, reading, drawing, and painting, and studying the world around me, often just sitting still, observing and drawing intently. I was quite poor, but I was learning a lot. In 1970, I embarked upon a number of projects that eventually took me to England and to Italy, a period of study and of original research, in part culminating in the book Across the Open Field. It's an ecological, social, and cultural history of the landscape of southern England, and in part it was inspired by the work of Fernand Braudel, one of the founders of the Annales School of Historical Writing and Ethnographic Study, and the originator in Paris, and the originator of a point of view that he had used a phrase to describe called the longue durée. Spending 2 years as a fellow at the American Academy in Rome, more of an, I'd say, an extended baptism, or a bath really, in European culture, one of my main goals was to study Italian urban life, its public realm, the historic landscapes, which had a deep influence upon me as a designer. Following my return to the States in 1974, I spent the next 8 years teaching in the Graduate School of Fine Arts at the University of Pennsylvania, where Ian McHarg, the author of Design with Nature, and the faculty that he'd assembled were developing methods for ecological planning and design. And where architects like Lou Kahn, who just died, and Louis Mumford, the urban historian and critic, among others, had made the school a hotbed of both theory and of practice. These natural factor maps that you see on the right, at the time, often took days to produce with the early overlay methods that our students were using. And it's now, these things are accomplished in a matter of hours or two by people anywhere around the world. It was difficult then, but not now, to do this. 2 years after my arrival at Penn, a colleague of mine and a friend from student days in Seattle, Robert Hanna, and I had the good fortune to open an office and to apply what we were teaching in practice. Here we are in Taroko Gorge doing field work for a plan for one of the first national parks in Taiwan. A number of people over the years have despaired about applying ecological methods in urban conditions, but there is no such thing as a blank site. There is always something there. But every site, everywhere, something is going on. It's in the world. And so we found we could map natural conditions for the initial projects of the 1979 Battery Park City Master Plan on the Hudson River in New York, as you see here in this drawing, to help us guide decisions regarding human comfort and the use on this exposed site. Or, other things that are present quite often are the invisible lives and culture that have occurred in the history of a place or a site. So, well, throughout the history of our office, one of our great interests, of course, has been in materials, in their source, their nature, the history of their use, and even beyond their physical, structural, and sensual properties, their literary and their cultural reference. This is not just my preoccupation. My partners share my interest in various forms of research and sharing the knowledge gained, as in this book by my partner, Susan Weiler, a few years ago, that grew out of our experiments and experience with building landscapes over architectural structures, something that I'd explored at length in the ruins of Imperial Rome and that we applied to a number of our projects, as you saw a few minutes ago. Here you see the upper images, another aspect of that conference center in Salt Lake from 1996, and the lower pictures are of Bryant Park, of course, from 1982. Craft may seem an odd topic to mention in relationship to research, But given the loss of so much traditional knowledge and skills as a result of modern economics and changing methods both of education and construction, we've had to take it upon ourselves not only to build well and accomplish things more commonly done years ago, but to figure out how to do it, to find out how to produce work that from traditions that are almost lost. In order to do research and to foster such things, we've developed a library in the office with a full-time librarian and a curator for our archive that includes analog and digital material, books, journals, drawings, photos, and other images, as well as physical samples and materials. We also have developed a research group and a committee that initiates and promulgates the results. Now, from my point of view, research always begins with firsthand experience. All forms of research begin with an idea of what to look at, whether from accident or a hunch, and then careful systematic observation, description, and evaluation of something. Much of my sketching and recording has been a personal effort, the result of curiosity. It's not been tied to a particular academic or professional agenda, and it's occurred from an abiding interest in the natural world. Initially in the Pacific Northwest, where I grew up and spent several formative periods, but then later, as you heard, in Europe and in other regions of the world. There is no substitute for firsthand experience, for learning to look carefully and simply sit still long enough to make a careful record of the subject of interest. In the course of what may seem a random set of encounters with the world, I have filled over 170 sketchbooks with drawings and notes from just being there and from paying attention, often repeated in different seasons, times of day, and over a number of years, noting physical changes in usage. This may be characterized as a non-directed form of qualitative research, especially concerned with the quotidian or the common ordinary things in aesthetic judgments and observations. Still, the first step in all research is to select something of consequence and describe it carefully. At the urging of friends and family, I have begun to publish some of the contents of these sketchbooks. The first such work, Be Seated, which you see, is a set of essays on the history of public seating in Western world. And this past June, I brought out France sketchbooks with a selection of drawings and observations from 1967 to the present, made in France. Next in the works will be a volume on Italy with drawings and observations from 1972 to the present, and then there will be more things come out after that, I hope. Well, professionally, our office has been involved in more directed and quantitative social investigation research, first beginning at Bryant Park in 1982. We had access to a study initiated by William H. White, funded by the Rockefeller Brothers Fund, regarding the social activities in what was then referred to as Needle Park. White's Project for Public Spaces documented the activities that you see here: heavy drug sale, moderate drug sale, heavy drug smoking, moderate drug smoking, sleeping, urinating, etc. in the park, what was going on, as well as he developed a suggested program for changes, improvements, and new uses. And then White went on to produce a film and a remarkable book, The Social Life of Small Urban Spaces, which confirmed and added to my observations and thoughts regarding behavior in the public realm. The results, both in terms of the design and the public-private partnership for its implementation and management, have been widely disseminated and influential. Subsequently, following more years of teaching at Penn with several anthropologists, our office, like many of our peers, has conducted public workshops, interviews, and surveys in the course of developing plans for public parks and urban developments. And because of our concern about the use of public space, an ongoing interest of mine regarding how we sit, where, and how long has led to working with clients and industry and to continuing experimentation and production for outdoor seating, not for profit, but for the sake of society and just for the fun of it. This is an old subject, but like many that have to do with qualitative and aesthetic issues, comfort and economy, it's inexhaustible. Here are a number of our employees back before the pandemic when we were still all together. Here, a number of them are trying out the profile of one of the mock-ups we made for a bench for one of Philadelphia's historic squares, which was then approved actually the following evening after these photos were taken by a meeting of a citizens advocacy group. Well, firsthand social information can only come from involvement with communities and with people. Community meetings can be exhausting. They lead to a controversy, often disappointment, if not executed very skillfully. The key is listening and paying attention to what people really need and feel, to try to understand what is really going on and not be swayed by cliches or captured by hobby horse zealots and fringe advocates. These happen to be sessions in California and Texas that we ran. Worthy results can be achieved in part from such community meetings, which can go on for a year or more, such as the SCORE or Matrix for a Park in Houston, where we gradually came to know many individuals in the community, not just the public administration. This plan took a year longer to produce than its sponsors had anticipated or hoped, but the outcome, a series of projects transforming Herman Park over a period of 20 years with over a dozen design firms realizing different portions of the plan, has been stunning. Another form of research that we've undertaken off and on for years when possible has been post-occupancy evaluation, POE. In particular, the social use and behavior of people in the places we have made. Problems with planting or with materials, when they occur, usually happen and are dealt with when we are still in close working relationship with the owners and contractors. And whatever lessons can be learned, we try to feed rapidly into the office knowledge base and employees who have little or no procedure. This particular project employed an updated version of the field techniques employed by White and by others to count and study the location, movement, and activities in Canal Park in Washington, D.C. at different times of day. And that the study could easily be extended to track such information through seasonal change. Of course, these studies are dependent upon funding and available personnel to do the work, which at times can be very difficult with professional offices. Now, technical issues around materials and construction is somewhat less fraught with cultural than, say, cultural or political controversy. This happens to be a very early project of ours involving the redesign of a principal retail commercial street in Denver, Colorado, exclusively for pedestrians and transit. Well, it was done, this sort of thing was done in numerous cities in the 1970s. It was largely not successful, except for here. Working with Harry Cobb, a partner of IMPay and the local transit authority, we developed a very simple yet elegant design consisting of 12 blocks of polychrome granite paving, trees, and a few furnishings, the most important of which was lighting that was highly functional and attractive. I began, as usual, by going to the site to see and experience it for myself, walking back and forth, studying the ends and the views, the buildings, the commerce, and I even followed people around when they came out to lunch to see where they went. Well, thinking of pavement as a fabric, we evolved a pavement system of granite pieces that were shaped to their various roles, but mostly they were square and they were laid diagonally. I was deeply concerned about how to plant trees adjacent to the pressure that would come from the lateral movement of the weight of the loads of moving buses that would be sure to over compact the soil and cause this problem. This led me to develop a defensive structure that could support unit pavers and allow tree roots to move laterally from where they were planted in the well-dried, well-drained, and friable soil. We also provided irrigation and under drainage for the trees while providing different support systems for the different areas. Well, the whole thing went together precisely like a piece of cabinetry. I remember the contractor asking me what the tolerance was for the tree locations, and I told him none. He was dumbfounded. I pointed out that we'd brought the trees from the Fox River near Chicago. We'd been growing them above ground in a nursery for 2 years that we'd set up just for the job, and he was going to plant them properly, that the planters were designed for them to grow if they were in the right place. Now, the photo on the left here was taken a year after installation. The one on the right, 35 years later. The trees worked out. People came downtown again. It was loved. It became a tourist attraction, and remarkable redevelopment occurred. We had made one mistake, however, with the pavement. The stones were wider than would have been best, but even worse was we used stacked, not staggered joints, and some of the stones moved and chipped and needed repair over the years. Well, a few years after the Denver project, we were commissioned by the city of Seattle to create a public park that really needed to be a square in the heart of the downtown. The site was a dysfunctional intersection with several vestigial structures that were to be removed. I continue to be interested in thinking of pavement as a fabric, wherein its very structure is also its ornament. And as in the case at Denver, it could be derived from historic functional art of the indigenous foundational culture that had lived and thrived in the region first. I happened to find a Salish basket from the tribe of Chief Seattle that had a geometry remarkably similar to that of the odd urban plaza that we were working with. Also, its palette was not dissimilar to several American granites that were available. And then, being from the Northwest myself, I had a desire to make something that looks better when it's wet than dry. As at Denver, we were concerned to make it clear to vehicle drivers they were passing through a pedestrian space. Humans were to be privileged over traffic movement. The space was different, and they were to slow down and appreciate it as well. Well, even though the pattern was to be extended from building face to building face as a field, not as a figure, as in the carpet runner in Denver, we knew that we should change the actual pavement structure and detail in the cartways from that of the pedestrian walks and plazas. We'd engaged a forensic engineer, Mark Smallridge, to study and advise us regarding such pavement. His advice was we needed to use smaller units and lay them in a herringbone pattern as had the ancient Romans and Europeans for centuries. That stacked joints, the simple 90-degree crisscross that architects always drew at that time, seemed neat and tidy and were easier and quicker to draw, but have no structural integrity. They were a tile detail, not a masonry one, so we followed his suggestion in the roadway portion. He also showed us that laying such a herringbone pattern was even stronger when laid diagonally to the movement of vehicles instead of being laid orthogonally, which again was the normal default drafting solution on the part of most designers. It was a simple matter of geometry and lateral movement of force. A typical area of a bus tire in the first case, the one on the left, didn't come in contact with as many bricks as the second case, the one on the right. Well, we took this knowledge and later we went to a different project, which you see in a model in an early section here in Los Angeles. We felt that somehow we could do this better. We should even try doing it. In this case, we did it with clay lug bricks, not stone. So working with one of my former students, I developed a number of polychrome patterns, in this case derived but not really imitating historic Pomo native weaving and basketry, and they have performed beautifully. We learned along the way also that the rubbing and the wear of tires, the grit from the city, and the dripping of oil tend to make cartways darker than the adjacent pedestrian areas. So I purposely set the patterns in various shades to take advantage of that, as well as further signaling to the public which areas are more or less dangerous. So there's a learning curve for us and for our office and for the field, because everything is really an experiment that you can learn from. Now, shifting to a different question or topic, one that's haunted our field and became important while we were working on a student residential project at the University of Washington in Seattle a few years back, my intention to reintroduce the native ecological conditions to an extensive hillside site, while it was possible, was made difficult because of the loss of the original complex soil and the difficulty of obtaining anything of suitable quality. My partner, Richard Rourke, began what became a multi-year campaign to produce what was needed, working with the local biologists, soil scientists, and several municipal waste treatment agencies, along with sand and gravel suppliers. This led Richard and our research group in the office into developing a series of pilot studies to create soil from a combination of urban waste products. Working with nearby researchers here from the University of Pennsylvania's biology department, grants were applied for and received, and tests with promising combinations have been underway now for nearly 2 years. This study then led my partners to several follow-up projects with an expanded team, including the Department of Landscape Architecture at Temple University, University of Pennsylvania, and Phil Krall, an independent soil scientist formerly with the U.S. Soil Conservation Service, and along with several local industries and members of our office. Suffice it to say, we are interested in science, but primarily for the purposes of employing applications to our design efforts. Now, one recent and still somewhat ongoing project presented several such examples. In 2011, that'd be 9.5 years ago now, we were asked to join a project that was then in planning and in early architectural design stage for a new corporate facility on a 150-acre abandoned suburban Hewlett-Packard site in Silicon Valley. The design that we developed with the architects, the client, increased the density on the site by 1 million square feet. We took it from 2.6 million to 3.6 million square feet of usable space, while we reduced the footprint of the buildings by 400,000 square feet, and we more than doubled the amount of pervious site area from 42.6 acres to 98 acres. The design that I proposed incorporated references to culturally significant historic agriculture, namely orchards, and the creation of a new rolling topography with native plants reminiscent of the historic context, specifically the nearby Coast Range and the more distant Sierra foothills and the memory of the meadows and grassland native to portions of the coastal hills of the South Bay region. This required the identification and propagation of hundreds of thousands of trees, understory, shrubs, and herbaceous plants, as well as several million plugs of various grasses. At the same time, we embarked on a series of experimental test mock-ups with a couple of manufacturers and suppliers with different aggregates and binders to produce several miles of paths and service drives, in large part from a desire to avoid the use of concrete and asphalt, but also to produce something that was durable and aesthetically sympathetic to our vision, which candidly was a contrivance or an artifice, that idea of seeming a natural surface, to put it in quotes. Now, let me remind you that our ideas of nature are primarily a social construction, and that landscape architecture habitually uses contrivance and artifice to invoke and suggest something that we think or mistake as nature. That what we make is largely an experiment. It's a life-size mock-up, full-size experiment in real time. This image is of one of the jogging trails that we created on that particular resultant site. Unremarked upon, there is low-level research on nearly every project to ensure success in planting, such as shown here, and it involves the testing of soil for pH, organic composition, and its drainage properties through lab testing of collecting samples, as well as numerous test pits, borings, and subsequent to planting, the use of soil probes to determine the rate of percolation and drainage. On this particular project, we were concerned about the large quantity and particular quality of soil that was needed. We engaged 2 soil scientists to help, which led to a study of soil surveys that had once been on the site and still might be present in some portions. Well, as luck had it, we discovered a couple of relatively deep deposits, which, along with modifications and portions of building excavation, allowed us to move over 1 million cubic yards of good soil about and to build the requisite topography and support the wide range of plants. Even so, the meadows concerned me. As I mentioned earlier, regarding our very first project, we discovered how complex and difficult they can be. Over the years, we'd done several, and each time learning more. One conclusion being that it usually takes at least 3 years to work through the problems of the invasive, the partial failures in germination, the temporary erosion, secession, etc., for a meadow to become fully established. This led us to developing a series of test plots in 2 locations with different grasses and suppliers, Pacific Sod in San Juan Bautista and Hedgerow Farms near Davis, California. Our interest was to produce several communities of native plants for different aspects and conditions of the site, and to test the mixes and quantities of grasses and the flowering perennials. We monitored them for 1.5 years, made some conclusions, and we moved on. Some of these meadows are 3 years old, others are 2, and a couple are only 1 year old. After counseling patience to the owner for the first year, I'm happy to say that the results have been gratifying to both the client and to us, and even as we continue to work through some of the issues with them. Where once Hewlett-Packard had a absolutely flat site with asphalt parking lots, roads, driveways, and a flock of 2-story tilt-up R&D buildings, there now are 150 acres of permeable habitat and recreation with features that has this increased density of population. There are more people on the site than there ever were before, and there is more natural process. Earlier, I mentioned a third form of research, and that is artistic research. Although things must work, they must make sense technically and economically, I strongly believe that they must also be aesthetically satisfying, essentially as rich as possible with whatever means one employs. So an example of this is the iterative nature of my ongoing exploration with some of the pavements that I've shown. Here is this small public square in Portland, Oregon with its biscuit-colored granite paving. It's with my ongoing interest in palette and proportion, color, texture, and expressive reference. It was partly inspired by indigenous baskets of the Columbia River Basin that were made of grasses. Nothing that we do like this is ever literal, however. We love to build and we love to ask, what next? Why not? What else? The last project we're going to look at now today considers one of the most compelling questions of today, and that is of access to nature in cities. It's a compelling and necessary question that requires all of the technical, imaginative, research, artistic, and social skills that our professions can bring. A number of people, a great number, for many years have been trying to figure out what on earth to do about the Los Angeles River. Most of the time it's pretty empty, but it also becomes a dangerous raging floodway every year because of monsoonal rains. In March of 2016, 5 years ago, our office became involved in producing a master plan for the Los Angeles River, 51 miles of it. We were invited to join Geary Partners. Actually, Frank called and said, you got to get out here to join me, to join them and a large local engineering firm, Geosyntec, with a strong history of civil engineering and regional projects involving hydrology. And in the course of the past 4 years, we've reviewed thousands of pages of historic and current planning documents. We've had a continuous series of meetings with the county supervisors, the public works staff, with an omnibus citizen steering committee, representatives from 14 different cities, while working continuously on the nuts and bolts of a plan and its implementation. Over a period of nearly 2 years, our office, with that of Frank Geary, embarked on a data and information quest. The result, the LA River Index, we have made public and available on the internet. It's a compendium of physical and social data regarding the health and situation of the population of the 15 municipalities. It isn't just the city of Los Angeles. Roughly 25% of the population of the state of California lives within an hour's drive of this river. The problem and the opportunity for something creative couldn't be greater. Nearly all of LA, of the LA River corridor and the floodplain, however, have been developed. The river has become exclusively a floodway that cannot be turned loose without enormous societal problems and costs. It isn't the same river and the same problem at various portions of its length. Like natural rivers, it has variation as it moves from upland to the sea. One of our first tasks was to map it and analyze it, and our hydrologists needed to rework old data and generate new information in light of recent experience and current projections based upon the absolute certainty of climate change, which has been as dramatic in California in recent years as it has been in the Arctic. Hydrologic and climatological facts have ruled out any fantasy of returning the concretized channel to a soft vegetated state, as our office and others around the country have done elsewhere, and as many in the region still dream of doing. Plans that were underway to create a more natural riparian conditions in an area that in LA that's referred to as the Narrows would only increase the hazard and the flooding of thousands of private properties. We looked carefully at the census tract information. We correlated it to the path of the river, and we began developing checklists of data regarding problems such as pollution that could be considered in developing any proposals in terms of social justice and equity, community needs, and resources. Coordinating this information from the UCLA public health data, several key widespread problems jumped out from census tract information, such as particular illnesses like asthma and type 2 diabetes, which when correlated to the path of the river and its historic adjacent land use and abuse, especially to the poverty rate of many of the nearest communities, told us a great deal. Continuing to work with available data, we were able to locate the people most in need of the societal costs in not dealing with it on a broader productive basis. Note the numbers: 2.4 billion annually spent on health conditions. 1 in 4 children obese. 1.3 billion spent on asthma hospitalizations. According to the World Health Organization and the US Center for Disease Control, it has been established that there is a direct correlation between proximity and access to parks and recreational programs and the reduction of both childhood and adult obesity, a major factor in a number of these debilitating and costly diseases. This led us to the obvious thought, the river offers an opportunity for 51 miles of connected open space, but given the existing situation, how would one produce it? What could it really turn out to be? In our experience, the answer meant getting out to the community, spending time, sharing meals with local residents and each other, learning and knowing the physical and social situation and the variations along the river, working with local governments and getting their officials and staff out into the field, making presentations and having meetings and workshops, and only then returning to the studio to test out hunches and ideas about what if. After a year, we arrived at a set of shared and agreed goals, ending up with 9 of them, 9 goals that had to do with flood safety, water management, water quality, its use, its storage, its supply, and habitat, ecosystem support, social support, such as equity regarding housing and the homeless, in addition to community access to recreation, health, and cultural facilities. In addition to presenting the data and facts regarding the multiple topics in our final report, one of the most important things designers can do for a community is to help them envision the possibilities for change and improvement in their lives and offer means to obtain them. We determined that we couldn't just do a plan and turn it over to the county, but we needed to explain the goals and their basis, and then we needed to help them to explain it to the communities. This led to our proposal for a range of series of projects. Many are small and extraordinary and extra small, and they're spaced fairly regularly throughout the entire length of the 51-mile corridor of communities along the river. But additionally, there were to be a number of medium, large, and extra large projects, again, based upon the scale and diversity of the communities and their demonstrated need. Because of the persistence and the probable increase in extreme storm events and the determination we couldn't plant in the channel without flooding significant portions of the communities, we developed a series of potential project types that could be deployed alongside and above the river in publicly owned and controlled land. One example is that of habitat possibilities. Depending upon location along the corridor and the nature of the location, the ownership, the topography, and the context, there's a number of possible habitat projects, varying in their nature and in their scale. Several of these are well positioned to contribute significantly to resident and migratory species, suggesting specific and not generic improvements. Now, the science behind this has been around for several decades. Our students have gotten really quite proficient at this, and it's been applied in numerous places around the country, but not to my knowledge at this scale and in such a meaningful way in a highly developed urban situation. Offstage, our team has been quietly testing these ideas without making any design proposals public, but setting the stage for the projects that are to follow to help establish their scope and their probable costs. This work, Frank's office and ours have largely done at our own cost as part of the creative research needed to enable projects to come forward over the next several decades. There will be work for many to do, and it surely won't necessarily look like what we've done. Here you can see my partner there in the upper left, Richard Rourke, working with one of our sketch models in Frank's office in Los Angeles during one of our monthly team meetings several years before we submitted our master plan to the county. One of the final tasks that we really did have to do was to show what the probable content and outcome of some of the various projects could be. As in this before and after example you see here, of a large ensemble of projects on, over, and alongside the juncture of the LA River and the Rio Hondo in Southgate and Bell Gardens in Southeast LA, adjacent to Compton, and it's very near Cudahy. You can see the difference before and after if they were to do some of the projects we've proposed for this place. A portion of the group of related projects that you just saw is shown in the sketch on the left. It's to be a created wetland intended to capture and clean rainfall and runoff from the adjacent community and highway while it's providing riparian habitat. The pedestrian circulation that you see here will function to connect the river, to connect several neighborhoods to the river corridor itself and to each other and to a cultural center across the river, which we have recently begun schematic design on a separate contract, as well as it will function for educational programs. Another part of this ensemble that you just saw is proposed as a deck over a portion of the floodway, a partial deck, which will support a district scale park with passive and active recreation. Again, the technology is old hat. We've been doing this kind of landscape overstructure for years. The 3-volume master plan was submitted 2 weeks ago to the county for public review, for commentary and mandatory environmental impact statement, then approval, and eventual incremental implementation. As with so much of our work, people want to know what it's going to look and feel like. So we make tentative but feasible concept decisions based upon our experience and likely budgets. But one of the several things we are certain is that we need to address the true scale of our problems, and we can no longer accept that we must choose between nature and the city. We must have both, the city and nature. As implied in the title of this talk and the things I've shown and discussed, in addition to research and craft and creativity, time is an aspect of our work. It's a feature of the medium of landscape. It's a condition of its realization. One might jokingly say that landscape architecture is the slow food of the art and design world. Instant gratification is rare. It's a long game. But patience has its rewards that can't be sped up and gotten quickly. The writer and art critic Megan O'Grady recently remarked, to live well in the city more conscientiously and more closely with nature, this has been a preoccupation of post-war architects. I happen to agree. Thank you very much.